Nobody could solve it. Not the brightest students in Harvard's history, not the heirs of legacy, not the champions of competitions who walked into that lecture hall with pride gleaming in their eyes. One by one, the finest minds in the world stared at the chalkboard, sweat dripping, lips tightening, and eventually heads lowering in defeat. The problem stood before them like a wall made of stone, daring them to climb it. They tried, oh, they tried, but every step ended in failure. Harvard's finest had given up. The hall was silent now, suffocating. You could hear the scratching of a shoe against the marble floor, the faint echo of a nervous cough. Professors shifted uneasily, their reputations trembling. If Harvard could not conquer this question, who in the world could? The challenge had been designed to humble even the proudest, to test not knowledge alone but vision, clarity, and the courage to see where others were blind. And then a sound broke the silence. It was not thunder. It was not applause. It was the soft clearing of a throat. From the very back row, where the overlooked always sit, a single hand rose. Thin fingers, shaking slightly, but raised with conviction. The hall turned as one, eyes narrowing, some frowning, some smirking. Who would dare? Who, after Harvard's brightest had fallen, would have the audacity to stand? A black scholarship boy. He did not belong to their world of polished shoes and custom suits. He did not carry the weight of family names engraved into marble halls. He carried something different, something unseen. His jacket was worn, his shoes scuffed, his notebooks lined with scribbles. From long nights of study under flickering dorm lights, he was not invited into Harvard's circle of privilege. He had clawed his way here with brilliance no one could deny, though many still doubted. And now, in the silence of giants brought low, he raised his hand. A murmur rippled across the room. "Him?" whispered a voice. A smirk tugged at another's lips. A few laughed outright, cruel in their dismissal. But the professors stared, curious, skeptical, but unable to look away. The boy stood slowly, his breath trembling in his chest. His eyes fixed on the board, not the crowd. He wasn't here to prove himself to their arrogance. He was here for the truth. The chalk squeaked faintly as he reached forward, small against the towering white wall of impossibility. And with every stroke he made, the room leaned closer. What Harvard's best could not see, what prodigies had abandoned in despair, this boy began to unravel. Numbers that had mocked geniuses now bent beneath his hand. Equations that had crushed pride now flowed like rivers, guided by his quiet determination. Line after line, symbol after symbol, the impossible began to take shape. The hall was no longer silent. Gasps filled the air. Whispers rose like storm winds. The boy's hand moved faster, more certain now, every mark a defiance of the world that had dismissed him. The impossible was not laughing anymore. It was trembling, as if it knew it was about to be broken. And in that room, where legends had failed and privilege had fallen silent, a scholarship boy wrote a story that no textbook had ever dared to contain. The chalk snapped in his hand, breaking clean in half, yet his movements never slowed. He grabbed the remaining piece and pressed forward, his strokes sharp, precise, like a blade cutting through centuries of doubt. Around him, the room pulsed with disbelief. The finest students of Harvard, the chosen, the privileged, the untouchable, sat frozen in their chairs, their pride cracking like glass. They had been silenced not by a professor, not by an institution, but by a scholarship boy they had mocked only hours earlier. Every symbol he wrote felt like a thunderclap in the hearts of those watching. The boy's dark eyes burned with focus, not once lifting to acknowledge the whispers, the sneers, or the shifting unease of the privileged. He had lived his whole life in the shadows of doubt, walking through doors others swore were locked. Every laugh, every dismissal, every reminder that he didn't belong here had carved steel into his soul. And now, in this hall of broken pride, that steel cut through the impossible. One professor leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose, his eyes wide with something he hadn't felt in years. Wonder. Another scribbled notes furiously, desperate to keep pace with the boy's unraveling logic. Yet others whispered to each other, trying to deny what they were seeing, their voices trembling with fear, because what was happening before their eyes was more than a solution. It was a revolution. The equations began to take form, a pattern hidden beneath layers of arrogance and blindness. The boy's hand flew across the board, faster now, bolder. What had once been chaos was revealed as order. What had once been despair revealed itself as hope. The impossible bowed its head, defeated line by line. And then it happened. He paused. His breath hung heavy, the chalk trembling between his fingers. The final step stared back at him. The last gate of the fortress no one had ever breached. The room held its breath. The silence was deafening, so thick it seemed even the walls leaned in to listen. Then, with a calmness that defied the storm around him, he wrote the final sequence. One mark, then another. The chalk squealed across the surface, leaving behind symbols that would echo far beyond Harvard's halls. And finally, he drew the line that sealed the answer. Gasps erupted like an explosion. Papers fell to the floor. Hands gripped desks. Students who had once sneered now stared in shock. Their mouths dry, their pride shattered. The problem was solved. The unsolvable had been broken, not by wealth, not by privilege, but by a boy who carried nothing but brilliance and determination. The professors rose from their seats, some stepping forward, their faces pale, their lips struggling to form words. For decades, this question had been a wall too high to climb, and now, before their eyes, a child of shadows had scaled it with ease. But the boy, he didn't smile. He didn't revel in their shock. His hand lowered slowly, his breathing heavy, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion and triumph intertwined. For him, this wasn't about recognition. It wasn't about applause. It was about proving, to them, to himself, to the world, that genius doesn't ask for permission. It simply rises. The hall erupted into chaos, voices shouting, professors debating, students scrambling to understand what had just happened. Yet in the middle of the storm, the scholarship boy stood still, his eyes calm, his expression unbroken, because he knew something the rest of them didn't. This was only the beginning. The silence that followed felt like thunder, heavier than applause, sharper than mockery. In the back rows, the privileged shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their confidence unraveling. For years they had worn their surnames like crowns, wielded their wealth like weapons, and believed their destiny was secured by birthright. Yet here, in the heart of Harvard, all their power had collapsed before. A boy who owned nothing but a scholarship and a dream. The professor in charge stepped forward, his hand trembling as it brushed the chalkboard. His eyes scanned the symbols again and again, as if searching for a flaw, a mistake, some salvation for the pride of the institution. But there was none. The logic was flawless, the path unshakable, the solution undeniable. He turned slowly, his voice breaking. "It's correct." Gasps tore through the hall. Some students dropped their pens. Others pressed their palms to their faces, unwilling to believe what they had just heard. Correct. The words spread like fire across the room. Correct, correct, correct. The impossible had been broken, but the boy didn't lift his head. He stood steady, his shoulders tense, his gaze fixed on the floor, because he knew this was bigger than him. This wasn't about outshining Harvard's brightest. It wasn't about humiliating the privileged. It was about rewriting what the world believed possible. And still the storm wasn't over. One of the elite students rose, his voice dripping with anger. "This is a trick. He doesn't belong here. He doesn't belong with us." His words cracked, a final act of pride clawing for survival. Yet his protest was drowned out by the rising voices of others, professors debating, students whispering, reporters scribbling, the air electric with history. The boy finally lifted his head. His dark eyes locked onto the accuser, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with a calm that shook the room more than any scream could. "Genius doesn't belong to privilege," he said, his voice low, but clear enough to echo in every corner of the hall. "It belongs to those who refuse to give up." The words hung there, etched into the very bones of Harvard itself. For a moment, time seemed to stop, and then slowly the room began to shift. Professors bowed their heads. Students who had once sneered now stared with respect or fear. The institution, older than nations, had been humbled by a scholarship boy. News of that day would travel beyond the walls, beyond the campus, across oceans. Headlines,